Henry, John Allison, does the United States have a strategy, a foreign policy strategy, or have we lost our way strategically?
One has to say that I would say in general, it is not easy to develop a coherent strategy within the American governmental system, largely because through much of the American history, every problem that has been recognized as a problem has proved to be soluble, and has proved to be soluble by the mobilization of resources. So almost invariably, when an American program is put forward, it has a time limit on it, after which it is assumed that the problem is solved and normalcy has returned. But in the world in which we now find ourselves, and in which almost every other nation has always found itself, the solution of a problem is an admission ticket to a new set of problems. So we are engaged in a process and not in a sequence of episodes that are terminated and then another episode. So that's inherent. But at this moment, it seems to me, we lack in my experience, the administrations that had a strategy were the Nixon administration, because the president had thought most of his life about these problems and studied them, and the Reagan administration, which had some fundamental principles which happened to fit the situation in which he was president very well. That doesn't mean there haven't been other successful episodes. At this moment, it seems to me that foreign policy lacks any guiding idea, and it's done in an entirely tactical manner, and that we are involved in unleashing revolutions whose consequence we don't understand, and in other activities that deal simply with the surface of issues. So I would answer that what we lack and what we have to develop on a nonpartisan basis is a concept that can be applied over an extended period of time. Britain was extremely influential in the 19th century and early 20th century, not because it was brilliant in any one situation, but because it was reliable and predictable, and because it had some basic tenets that it applied consistently over a period of time. That we lack at this moment.
And Dr. Kissinger, what would the predicate of that be? What would the strategy be?
Well, first of all, I could be very brilliant in my analysis without necessarily be able to give you all the answers. I'm not claiming that I'm wandering around the world with unfulfilled policy prescriptions that have not been adopted. I think the predicate of a policy would be, first of all, an agreed analysis of the world in which we find ourselves. What are the fundamental dynamics of this world? What are the goals towards which we should move? what are the tactics by which we could implement them? And what are the intellectual premises that have to be achieved? Those are some of the questions that seem to me that need to be answered on a consistent basis. If you look at the wars America has fought since the end of World War II, they were entered with sweeping ambitions and wide public support. They were transformed step by step into demands for withdrawal strategy. It is absurd to fight a war for a withdrawal strategy. There has to be some definable objective, and we have not managed to achieve this. And we see that now. We've seen it in Vietnam. I served in an administration which inherited a war, and then the people who started it joined the peace movement, defined as just getting out. But the same is true in Iraq. It is now true in Afghanistan. Anybody who knows any history knows that history will not stop when we withdraw from Afghanistan. And in fact, that is the defining characteristic of that region. I see no debate. I'm not saying we should stay forever, but I'm saying we have to answer the question of what evolves where China, India, Pakistan, Russia, Iran, and we encounter each other. And I've already stated my general observations about the Middle East. I'm not saying I have the answers to all of these questions, but I am saying that if we do not work on these questions and on the general framework that I've described, we will be driven by circumstances and public relations into a very difficult situation.
Dr. Kissinger?
Oh my God.
By your reference to British statesmanship. I wonder, could I just ask you, of the great British statesmen of the 19th century, Castlereagh, Canning, Palmerston, Disraeli, Gladstone, whom you consider the most able, whom you consider the least able, and whom you consider the best guy for America?
I mean, in Britain,
Yes, the 19th century British statesman.
well, I think Castlereagh had a great vision of Europe, which which Europe is only catching up with now. But he was a century ahead of his time. But it is important to have a vision available. I think Palmerston was a classic operator of the system at a time when Britain, so he was a good guide for that generation, but left no legacy that could be applied to a rising Germany and a change in British predominance. I think Disraeli, and from a foreign policy point of view, Salisbury had an instinct for what was needed in adjusting the world for the kind of conservatism that I would look for. But when you are the dominant country, it is very hard to get used to the proposition that your dominance has to be attenuated, not lost, but has to be attenuated and put into a larger context. And for that, unfortunately, it required World War I. To me, the great failure of Western statesmanship is World War I. Not one of the statesmen who entered World War I would, in 1914, would have done so had they known what the world would look like 4 years later. And that they couldn't foresee that evolution. And I don't think the British were the greatest sinners in this respect. In my analysis, the breakdown of conceptual thinking was largely on the German side. Not because they were so aggressive, but because they did not understand that when they were already the largest land power, the aspiration to being also the largest, a large sea power, was would never be acceptable to Britain. And because they set themselves war aims, which could only be achieved by the complete destruction of the system from which they themselves had profited. If Britain made a mistake, it was not recognizing the inherent dynamics of the system. And I believe that we are now in a world whose dynamics are different from what we are used to, but in which our major role is nevertheless essential, and to carry both ideas forward simultaneously. That the dominance we can exercise is of a different nature, but still vital. But to recognize the circumstances and the time frame in which that is, in my view, our big challenge. And our political election mechanism does not permit that issue to be raised at all.
Thank you very much, Henry. I'm afraid that we must call an end to this part of the festivity, but we will conduct our valedictory rites downstairs where the reception was, and I think Henry will be there for at least a little while, and perhaps we can continue the conversation there. I'd like to thank you all for coming. We have a gift for Henry. It is a first edition of some of Burke's political writings, especially pertinent, I think, is his treatise on thoughts on the cause of our present discontents, a title which I've always liked and try to use often. But it's a tract about the abuse of power and what we should do about it. I think it's uncannily pertinent to our situation here in the United States and perhaps in Europe as well. And it's our pleasure, Henry, to present you with this first edition.
Really appreciate it. Very much so. Do you have a text for this? Please.
Please join us all downstairs for a valedictory nightcap.